Good morning everyone and welcome to this new video. Today we will continue the journey on the history of psychology by analyzing a new current, namely behaviorism. We left off last time in the very great diatribe that went on for a very long time between functionalists and structuralists, and as often happens in these situations, between one current saying one thing and another current saying exactly the opposite. Eventually a third current emerges. 1913, in fact, is an emblematic date because it sees the birth of this new current of thought, precisely behaviorism, with the release of an essay entitled Psychology as the Behaviorist Sees It. This work is considered precisely the manifesto of behaviorism and is written by Watson, who will be considered precisely the father of this current. In every page, in every word of this work, Watson wholeheartedly distances himself from every current that had preceded him, because, as we have seen, both the functionalists and the structuralists in some way studied the mind, and that is, the structuralists separated it into small units and studied each individual part of it, while the functionalists studied it as a whole and tried to understand what functions it had. Instead, Watson completely abandoned studies of the mind, as he believed that the mind cannot be studied at the empirical level, but the only thing that can be studied at the empirical level and therefore visible, experienceable, directly observable is behavior. So, as the object of investigation of psychology, the mind discourse is abandoned, and the only truly observably variable is taken into consideration, and that is behavior. In the work I mentioned earlier, Psychology as the Behaviorist Sees It, Watson tends to denounce what are the basic assumptions precisely of this new current of thought. First among them is that psychology is a true experimental science and is aimed at predicting and controlling action. And secondly, in order to achieve this rigor and exactness that a real science demands, one must abandon all those objects of study that cannot be empirically studied and therefore cannot have relevant scientific basis and exact results, as had been done until now with the mind. And therefore, instead of the mind, as I anticipated earlier, one must go, according to Watson, to study what are behaviors, which are the only variables that can be directly observed and tested. According to Watson, in fact, behavior is externally detectable and therefore amenable to scientific analysis. Behaviorism, as we were saying, was born in 1913, but then developed over the years and would have a certain fortune until about the 1960s and would be divided into various phases, in that it would be both first and second generation behaviorists who would bring with their ideas and their thinking so many changes even within this same current of thought. The first phase is from 1913 to 1930. It was born and developed thanks to Watson and with his thinking on classical conditioning. The second phase, on the other hand, which runs from 1930 to 1950, will see other protagonists come into play, including Skinner, and people will begin to talk about operant conditioning. The third phase, on the other hand, will be from 1950 onward, and will deal with social learning, then with all those behaviors that are enacted in the social sphere. The object of study, as I said before, is what is observable and what is therefore experienceable and evaluable, hence behavior. In fact, behaviorism aims to study only those behaviors that are directly observable. According to this current of thought, behaviors arise from a perennial dualism, which is that between mind and body. In practice, this means that man consists of two aspects, the immanent, which would be the body, and the transcendent, which would be the mind. Basically, they think that in order to study man, one has to start from the study of the body, that is, from the study of what, I repeat, is directly observable, precisely the body, and then go on to resolve what are the mental functions. These studies then, from Watson onward, will be reflected on learning as it is observed in the laboratory and with the studies that are done by all these behaviorists, that both humans and animals tend to acquire behaviors that lead them to satisfy, for example, their own needs, and then to learn certain behaviors and to make them their own as they lead them to achieve a purpose. So behaviorists try to go and analyze what are those mechanisms that underlie certain behaviors acquired by both humans and animals. In a nutshell, this means going to see where the abilities, the skills of each of us arise, but also the emotional reactions that we may have in certain situations, for example, reactions of adversity or fear, and how we acquire these behaviors. Watson in his experiments took his cue from studies done already by an earlier Russian physiologist, Pavlov, who had seen how certain behaviors of animals could be conditioned when subjected to a certain stimulus. As for the experiments and studies done by Pavlov, we will see them in the next video that I will dedicate to this very great scholar who also won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1904. On the other hand, if you want to learn more about Watson, you can catch up with the video I have already dedicated to the author, where I analyze all his experiments and also how he reported these results of his experiments in school learning. Watson then takes this concept of classical conditioning that Pavlov had experimented with on animals, on humans, and tries to explain with his experiments how indeed there is nothing innate, but how much we can be conditioned by a given stimulus in our actions. On the other hand, as far as second-generation behaviorists are concerned, they move from the concept of classical conditioning to the concept of operant conditioning, and that is, they go on to analyze how much a behavior can be conditioned by insertion, and thus can change precisely by the insertion of a positive or negative reinforcer, that is, how much the insertion of a reinforcer can condition and cause new behaviors to be acquired. Again, I have already devoted very in-depth videos on both Thorndike and Skinner, which you can catch up on here in the info box, which I recommend you go and watch precisely to try to get a good understanding of these differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Well, with this discourse on behaviorism that has somehow overcome the existing diatribe between functionalism and structuralism, and having analyzed the various phases of this current, I salute you. I will refer you to the next video in which I remind you we will talk about Pavlov and we will go into all his studies in depth. I salute you and thank you for your attention.